You may have helped someone once, not because you expected anything, not because it seemed significant at the time, just because they needed it, and you were there. Perhaps they were struggling with something they couldn't manage alone. Perhaps they reached out, or perhaps you simply noticed. Either way, you showed up. You gave what you could, time, attention, presence, maybe resources. You didn't think much of it. And for a while things seemed fine. They were grateful, or at least they appeared to be. The connection felt natural. There was no tension, no hesitation. You moved through it without questioning whether you'd done the right thing. But then, after everything settled, after the crisis passed, after they no longer needed what you'd offered, something shifted. They changed. Something in their manner became different, subtle at first, but undeniable. And there was nothing dramatic between you, no argument, no obvious moment you could point to, just a certain distance, a coolness in their tone, a reluctance to engage. Small things, but unmistakable. The ease that had been there before was gone, and in its place was something you couldn't quite name. And so the questions began. Did I help too much? Did I overstep? Was I too present, or not present enough? Did I say something I shouldn't have? Did I misread the situation entirely? You turned the memory over in your mind, searching for the moment you got it wrong. But the moment never appeared. Because when something changes like that, the mind rarely looks outward first. It turns inward. And so you began to wonder. Maybe you helped too much. Maybe you inserted yourself into something that wasn't yours to carry. Maybe you made yourself too available, and in doing so, created an imbalance you didn't intend. You replayed the conversations, the moments, the offers you made, searching for where you might have overstepped. Or perhaps it was the opposite. Maybe you didn't help enough. Maybe what you gave wasn't what they actually needed. Maybe you misread the situation entirely, and what felt like support to you felt like something else to them. Maybe you failed them in some way you still can't see. You defended them in your own mind. You told yourself they were just busy, or going through something, or that you were reading too much into it. You gave them the benefit of the doubt long after the doubt had already settled in. And then the sharper questions came. Maybe you crossed a line. Maybe there was something unspoken you violated. Maybe the help itself carried a weight. You didn't realize, and they've been carrying it silently ever since. You turned it over again and again, convinced that if you thought about it long enough, the answer would appear. But the question that kept returning was simpler and more confusing. Why would someone you helped turn against you? But the answer didn't come, because the answer wasn't in what you did. Yet what if none of those questions touched the real cause at all? Because if you look closely at the timeline, something doesn't quite fit. When they were in need, when they were struggling, vulnerable, uncertain, your help was welcomed, perhaps even sought. There was no hesitation, no distance, no awkwardness. But after they recovered, after the crisis passed, after they no longer needed what you offered, that's when the shift began, not during the difficulty, after it. That's the part that doesn't make sense, isn't it? If your help had been invasive, you'd expect resistance during the act itself. If you'd crossed a boundary, you'd expect tension in the moment. If you'd failed them somehow, you'd expect disappointment while they were still in need. But none of that happened. The gratitude was real, the relief was visible, the connection at the time seemed genuine. It was only later, when the pressure lifted, when things returned to normal, when they no longer required your presence, that something changed. And that timing matters, because it suggests that the reaction was never to your help itself, but to what it meant, what it represented, what it left behind, what it reminded them of long after the moment had passed. You weren't rejected for what you did. You were rejected for what remained. To understand this, you have to see what help leaves behind, long after the moment has passed. Help, when it is given, particularly to someone whose sense of self is fragile, does not simply dissolve once the need has passed. It leaves something behind, not a memory of gratitude necessarily, Not even a memory of the act itself. What it leaves is a record, a psychological record of position. When someone accepts help, the mind quietly registers certain facts, not as judgments, not as accusations, just as truths that cannot be unwritten. It registers, I was in need. It registers, I could not manage alone. It registers, someone else had what I lacked. These are not moral statements. They carry no inherent shame. They are simply observations of a moment, situational, temporary, circumstantial. But they persist, because the mind does not only remember what happened, it remembers what the event revealed. Your help became proof, quiet, undeniable proof, of three things: that they were weak, at least in that moment, that they were dependent, at least temporarily, that you were positioned above them, however briefly, however unintentionally. You may never have thought of it that way. You may never have wanted that position. You may have offered help with no awareness of hierarchy at all. But the record doesn't ask what you intended. It only notes what occurred. And even if you never speak of it again, even if you treat them with perfect equality afterward, even if you never reference the moment, never remind them, never hold it over them in any way, the mind remembers. It remembers what was true. And that memory does not remain quiet. It begins to work on them. What begins as memory does not stay memory for long. It becomes pressure. Because the mind, left alone with that record, begins to feel its weight. There is shame, not the loud kind, not humiliation or self-hatred, but something quieter, a subtle awareness of having been seen in weakness, of having been exposed, even if only briefly, of being known in a way that cannot be undone. That awareness lingers, and alongside it there is debt, not spoken obligation, not a favor owed in any formal sense, but an internal feeling of being bound, of carrying something unspoken, of owing something that can never quite be repaid because it was never requested in the first place. That too does not fade easily. Then there is the tension between two truths that cannot comfortably coexist. On one hand, I see myself as capable, independent, someone who manages. On the other, I needed help. I could not do it alone. The discomfort in holding both at once is not dramatic, but it is persistent, and the mind, in its need for coherence, begins searching for a way to resolve it. And beneath all of this, subtle but undeniable, is the irritation of imbalance and envy, a quiet discomfort with having been, even temporarily, in a lower position, with having needed what someone else had, with the fact that, for a moment, the dynamic was unequal. That feeling does not announce itself, but it remains. And here is what makes the timeline clear. During the crisis, none of this mattered. The need was immediate. The relief was real. Gratitude was easy because survival was the priority. But after recovery, after the immediate danger passed, after things returned to normal, that's when the pressure began to build. Because now there was space to feel it. So you weren't imagining the shift. You weren't misreading the timeline. The change came after, not during, because the pressure only emerged once the crisis no longer obscured it. Pressure like that demands release, and the mind will. Choose relief long before it chooses honesty. When pressure builds like that, the mind does not ask, what is accurate? It asks, what will make this stop? And the answer it finds is rarely the truth. It is the story that brings the most relief. This is not conscious. It is not calculated. It is simply how the mind protects itself when discomfort becomes unbearable. And so, quietly, adjustments begin. The help itself starts to shrink in memory, not dramatically, not all at once. But the edges soften. The significance fades. It wasn't that big. Anyone could have done that. It didn't really change anything. The discomfort of owing lessens when the thing owed feels smaller. Then the discomfort begins to move outward. Because if the pressure cannot be reduced by minimizing the help, it can be redirected by reinterpreting the helper. Motives are quietly assigned. Intentions are assumed. They wanted something. They needed to feel important. They were trying to gain leverage. None of this may be true, but it doesn't need to be. It only needs to ease the internal strain, and once the helper's role is reinterpreted, the past itself begins to shift. The story changes tone. The memory of the moment is edited, not erased, but reframed. What once felt like kindness now feels like something else. What once felt like support now carries weight it didn't have before. The narrative adjusts to match the present feeling. And finally, there is the need to reclaim what was temporarily surrendered: autonomy. Distance restores it. Rejection proves it. Pushing away becomes a way of reasserting control, not over the past, but over the present sense of self. I don't need them. I never did. The further they move, the freer they feel. This is the mind of someone insecure, choosing relief over honesty, ease over accuracy, comfort over clarity. At that point, the question is no longer how they feel, but who that pressure becomes attached to. The pressure, once formed, does not remain abstract. It has to land somewhere, and it lands on the person who represents it. You become the reminder, not because you mention it, not because you hold it over them, not because you ask for anything in return, but simply because you were there. Your presence, however kind, however neutral, however careful, recalls a chapter they would prefer to close, a version of themselves they no longer want to carry. Even silence does this, even distance, even the absence of expectation. The fact that you existed in that moment is enough. You become the witness. You saw something they wish had never been seen. You remember what they needed when they could not provide it themselves. You know a truth about them that cannot be undone, no matter how much time passes. And even if you never speak of it, even if you treat them with perfect equality, even if you never remind them, never reference it, never hold it in your expression or your tone, the knowing remains, and the knowing is the problem. Then, slowly, you stop being a person. You become a symbol, not of who you are, but of what that moment represented. Dependence, weakness, imbalance, a time when they were not enough and someone else was. You are no longer engaged with as yourself. You are managed, avoided, kept at a distance, reinterpreted, because what you represent cannot be reconciled with how they need to see themselves. You were not rejected for what you did. You were rejected for what your existence continued to mean. Once you are seen that way, the relationship can no longer remain neutral. Turning against you is not a reaction. It is a solution, because hostility, distance, coldness, rejection accomplishes something very specific. It resolves what pressure alone could not. It deletes the debt. If you become bad, the obligation disappears. Gratitude is no longer required. What was owed is nullified, because the person it was owed to is no longer worthy of it. The ledger clears. It rebalances status. Distance restores equality. Coldness removes the memory of hierarchy. Rejection erases the imbalance that existed, however briefly. If they push you away, the asymmetry is corrected. If they diminish you, the dynamic levels. If they attack, the relationship no longer reflects a moment in which you were above and they were below. The scales settle. It restores autonomy. Rejecting you proves independence. Creating distance demonstrates that they do not need you, that they never did, that whatever was given has no lasting claim. Pushing you away becomes evidence of self-sufficiency. It protects the narrative. For the story to remain intact, for them to remain the hero of their own life, you cannot stay as you were. The version of events in which you helped must shift into a version where your role is questioned, minimized, or reframed. They did it themselves. Or it wasn't that significant. Or you had motives that complicate the meaning. The story adjusts so the self can stay whole. And finally, it removes the witness. Your presence validates the past. Your memory holds what they wish to forget. Removing you physically, emotionally, relationally removes the reminder. If you are not there, the chapter closes more cleanly. Hostility is not emotional. It is psychological self-maintenance. It completes the circuit. It resolves the pressure. It restores what the help disrupted. Understanding this changes how one carries help and who it is given to. Not everyone can tolerate being helped, not because they are bad people, not because they lack gratitude, but because the internal cost of receiving, shame, debt, diminished autonomy, outweighs what was given. That is not a moral failure. It is simply a reality, and understanding that changes what help becomes. Because help, when given freely, does not need to linger. It does not need to be remembered. It does not need to be acknowledged. It does not require the other person to carry it forward, emotionally or otherwise. The pain was never in the act of helping. The pain came from holding it, from replaying it, from wondering why it changed things, from expecting that kindness would naturally return kindness, that presence would be met with presence, that care would be recognized as care. But once you see what actually happened, once you see the mechanism at work, the need to replay it begins to quiet. You were not rejected because you failed. You were not pushed away because you did something wrong. You were rejected because your help could not be integrated without disruption. And rather than face that disruption, the mind chose to remove you. That is what happened. And knowing that allows you to release what you have been carrying and help more wisely. Help that can be walked away from is help that was truly free. It was given without condition. It does not need to be returned. It does not need to be honored. It simply was. And once given, it is no longer yours to manage. There is also this question, and it is worth sitting with quietly. If the roles were reversed, if you had been the one in need, would they have helped you? Not as judgment, not as an accusation, just as grounding. Because the answer, held honestly, often clarifies what the relationship actually was. Seen clearly, the experience no longer needs to be carried as a wound. The reaction was never to your help. It was to what the help revealed, what it represented, what it left behind in their understanding of themselves. And once you see that clearly, once you understand the mechanism at work, the confusion lifts. You were not the problem. You were the reminder of a moment they could not reconcile, and rather than reconcile it, the mind chose to remove you. That is what happened. And knowing that allows the experience to settle, not as betrayal, not as failure, just as something that occurred for reasons that had nothing to do with your worth. Now tell me in the comments, have you ever helped someone who later became distant or even turned against you? If this brought something to mind, you're welcome to share it below. And if this way of seeing things resonates with you, you can support the channel by liking, sharing, or subscribing. Understanding doesn't erase what happened, but it does remove the need to carry it as a wound.